Okay, so much for form criticism. Now let's talk about redaction criticism and source criticism and the so-called synoptic problem. If you read the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke in what they call a synopsis, that's where you can see all three of them together, and you read them side by side, you'll first be struck with the similarities in wording, content, and order. But then if you look a bit more closely, you'll probably start to note some of the divergences in the exact wording, content, and arrangement of the same passages. You may also notice entire blocks of material that are present in one gospel, but not in the others. For example, the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew is paralleled in large measure by the Sermon on the Plain in Luke, but then it's completely absent from Mark. These kinds of similarities and dissimilarities demand some kind of explanation. Okay, and that's why we have these two fields of study: source criticism and redaction criticism. Source criticism seeks to discover what sources were used by a given author and how those sources might have originated and developed over time. Redaction criticism is a closely related field. It seeks to show how these sources were modified or redacted by a given author. Ancient authors often used other sources, sometimes even incorporating large swaths of material into their own work. It was pretty common, though, for them to do this without mentioning what their sources were, and so that makes it a bit difficult for us to identify those sources. One thing that source critics try to do is look for certain signals within a text. For example, they might look for similar or identical wording in other sources. That seems easy enough, right? If you see the exact wording of something in an earlier source, then you can often infer that the later author used that source. Well, we haven't talked about which of the Gospels came first yet, but you can see that there's a lot of similarity here. All the stuff in brown is basically identical in all three Gospels. Now there's a little bit of variation here. For example, the term the Son of Man, which both Mark and Luke have in common, but you don't find it in Matthew's Gospel. And then here you've got some similarity between Matthew and Luke, where it says, on the third day he will be raised, whereas in Mark, it's a little bit different. It's still quite similar, but it says after 3 days he will rise again. So how do you deal with all these similarities and differences? Here again, you got agreement between Matthew and Luke, but they both seem to be drawn on Mark here, and in both these cases, and yet there's also some overlap between Matthew and Luke. So these are the types of issues that source critics look at, and they try to figure out, okay, so who is drawing on whom, and which of these authors wrote first? What's the relationship between them? Okay, in looking for these sources, source critics will also look for breaks, disruptions, or dislocations in the sequence, including redundancy. So for example, this passage in Mark chapter 9, this is the disciples, they are asking Jesus, why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And Jesus said to them, Elijah does come first and restore all things. And how is it written of the Son of Man that he should suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I tell you that Elijah has come, and they did to him whatever they pleased, as it is written of him. Now, interpreters have for a long time tried to figure out, what is the relation of these words to this other stuff here? Well, most likely, it seems to me, what you have is, how do I do this? It's a lot harder in PowerPoint than it is in a Word document. Oops, not superscript. I want strike through. So if I just do this, we cancel that out, then we're left with a pretty coherent Kreia right here, okay? A little short narrative. It says, and they asked him, why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And he said to them, Elijah does come first and restore all things, but I tell you that Elijah has come, and they did to him whatever they pleased, as it is written of him. It makes a lot better sense when you just have this. So source critics and other commentators have suggested that perhaps Mark himself inserted this into the tradition, or maybe he drew from some other tradition and kind of inserted it into the text here. But originally that wouldn't have been there, so it would have just been that. So this was his original source, and then when Mark redacted it a bit, we were left with that. And so that's how it stands in the Gospels today. So this is the type of thing that source critics will look for. All right, they'll also look for inconsistencies in writing style, ideology, history, etc., thus reflecting the perspective of two different sources. We can compare especially the Gospel of John with the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic Gospels being Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're called the Synoptic because they're very similar to each other, and you can read them together. You can look at them together. Right. So in the study of the Gospels, source critics attempt to understand how the four Gospels relate to one another, especially in terms of which Gospel came first and which one made use of the others. When interpreters speak of the synoptic problem, they're referring to the issue of how the synoptic Gospels, that is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, relate to one another. These three Gospels are much more similar to one another than they are to the Gospel of John. So source critics have long suspected that one or more synoptic author was using one or more other synoptic Gospels as his source or sources. Mark is usually thought to have been the first of the synoptic Gospels written. This is referred to as Markan priority. Okay, so now there have been other theories too. As early as Augustine, it was thought that Matthew was the first Gospel to have been written, and he was followed by Mark, who condensed Matthew. I'm not sure if Augustine thought that Mark was written last, but anyway, Mark is known as the epitomizer. He is the abridger of Matthew, and maybe of Luke as well. Well, there are other theories too. As I said, Mark is usually nowadays thought to have been the first Gospel written, but there is some debate about how things went after that. Did Matthew draw on Mark, and did Luke then draw on Mark and Matthew? Or did Luke write before Matthew, and then Matthew drew on Luke, who was originally drawn on Mark? Or did Matthew draw on both Luke and Mark? There's all sorts of different possibilities there. So here are a few of them. Mostly, as I said, source critics tend to think that Mark wrote first, and there are lots of reasons for that, which I won't go into. But the real dispute is about who came next. Was it Matthew or Luke? Now, for a long time, it's been thought that Matthew was the next one written, but in more recent decades, the idea of Matthean posteriority has become much more fashionable. And so perhaps he was writing last. Well, there are a lot of different theories, as I said. You got this one, you got this one. And then here's one that has been quite common for many decades. It's the view that Matthew and Luke had basically two sources. Now, there are lots of other sources too, and you could write it out in a much more complicated way like this, where you see Matthew is drawing on Q, he's also drawing on M, he's also drawing on these Antiochian traditions, but then he's also drawing on Mark. So Mark, still in this scheme, is the first of the Gospels written, but then you've also got these other sources too, which are hard to date. And then Luke wasn't drawing on M, but he was drawn on L, and he may have drawn on another source for chapters 1 and 2 of his Gospel, where you're dealing with like the nativity scenes and that sort of thing. Well, various hypotheses have been proposed over the years, but as of yet there is no definitive solution to the synoptic problem. Matthean priority seems to have yielded the least scholarly acceptance. The two-source hypothesis and Matthean posteriority seem to be the most widely accepted at this time. Okay, but here are some of the main theories. You've got the Griesbach hypothesis. The idea here is that Matthew wrote first, and then Luke used Matthew, and Mark used both Matthew and Luke. So it can be written up in two different ways. Either Matthew was the first gospel, and then he was used by Luke, and then Mark made use of both Matthew and Luke, or perhaps Matthew, when he wrote the first gospel, he was drawn on Q, and then Luke actually wrote independently of Matthew, but then Mark made use of both Matthew and Luke. So two different ways that you can formulate the Griesbach hypothesis. But as I said, this is the one that has been the dominant view among scholars for at least the last century or so. And it's the view that Matthew and Luke made use of at least two sources, two main sources, Q and Mark. Okay, so it's pretty simple if you put it like that, but if you draw it up like this, you can see it's quite a bit more complicated. Because Q, we don't know, Q just means source. So we don't know if it's a singular source. We don't know if it included some of this other stuff, some of the M traditions, some of the L traditions, some of the stuff that they used in their non-Markan traditions, other than what's normally classified as M and L. And then we have the Farrer hypothesis, where Mark wrote first, and Luke made use of Mark, and then Matthew made use of Mark, and Luke also didn't just make use of Mark, but he also made use of Matthew. And then Matthean posteriority, which goes like this. Mark wrote first, Luke next, and then Matthew made use of Luke and possibly Mark as well. All right, well, let me elaborate a little bit more on Q, and then we're also going to talk about M and L. So first of all, Q, probably the most widely accepted hypothesis, as I said, is that Matthew and Luke both wrote independently of one another. Also, that they both used the Gospel of Mark and another source that no longer survives called Q. Now this sigla here comes from the German Quelle, which means source. Okay, so it's not a very descriptive term, but that's where the Q comes from, in case you wanted to know. Has nothing to do with Star Trek, has nothing to do with Qumran. Now the agreements between Matthew and Mark, or between Luke and Mark, are attributed to Matthew or Luke having used Mark. But then the agreements between Matthew and Luke, when there's no corresponding material in Mark, obviously can't be attributed to their use of Mark, so it's attributed to their use of Q. Right, so here's how it looks. You've got the two gospel writers here drawing from these two main sources, Q and Mark, okay? But they wrote independently of one another. Now again, you could draw this up in a way that is much more complicated. This is B.F. Streeter's way of mapping it out, but you kind of get the point if you just map it like this. It's a bit more simple, easier to kind of visualize this. Source critics have spent enormous time and energy trying to reconstruct and trace the redactional and theological developments of this hypothetical Q text. The effort may well be a fool's errand for several reasons. First of all, Q may not have even existed. Sayings attributed to Q may have simply been invented by either Matthew or Luke. Second, Q may have consisted of multiple sources, some of which may have been oral. Third, the methodologies used to pinpoint redactions and theological developments are quite subjective much of the time, and scholars have disagreed widely with each other about what material was more primitive and what material was more developed. Okay, well, in order to understand what we're talking about here with, reconstructing the original Q text and whatnot, it's good to look at a couple of examples. So let's do that real fast. We have, first of all, the Lord's Prayer. All right, so you're probably all familiar with this, but are you familiar with the ways that Matthew and Luke disagree in their wording? Maybe not. So let's look at this. You can see all the stuff in blue matches in both Matthew and Luke, but then the stuff in gray doesn't match. Then the stuff in green, I'm going to say that's likely original, but it's hard to say because it's not attested in both traditions. We only find it in Matthew. Or in the next one, we will only find it in Luke. So if it occurs in both Matthew and Luke, when there's nothing to match that in Mark, then we can conjecture that Matthew and Luke were probably using Q at that point. But if there's disagreements, then it's hard to know. Did Matthew redact Q? Did Luke redact Q? Did Matthew leave something out? Did he kind of add his own spin to it or something like that? It's difficult to know sometimes. But if we put the two together and we compare them like this, then we can try to reconstruct the original Q text. All right, so Matthew, we know he's quite keen on talking about God as being in heaven. Okay, so a lot of Q scholars have concluded from that this here was not something that was in the original Lord's Prayer. This was something that Matthew added. Okay, and this, as I said, is a little bit more ambiguous. Now here we've got, in Luke's gospel, he says, forgive us our sins, which makes good sense to us. We understand exactly what that means. In Matthew's gospel, however, he says, and forgive us our debts, as we have also forgiven our debtors. So he uses a different metaphor. Luke kind of brings in the idea of indebtedness here too, but this metaphor is more consistent in Matthew's gospel. And this, a lot of Q scholars will say, is more original because it kind of fits with a Semitic metaphor. Okay? Now you have to remember, just because it has a Semitic flavor to it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's more original. But in this case, it seems to be. All right, and then finally we have this thing, but deliver us from evil, which doesn't occur in Luke's version of the prayer. So is that more original, or is it just a Matthean insertion? Well, Q scholars tend to see this as a Matthean insertion. So here we go with the hypothetical original Q text. Father, not Father in heaven, not our Father, but just Father, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation. Okay, and then another excerpt from Q. This is the sign of Jonah in the Gospel of Matthew and Luke. And we have some overlap here as well in the Gospel of Mark. But you can notice here that there's much more agreement between Matthew and Luke than there is between Matthew and Mark, or between Luke and Mark. So once again, scholars have inferred from this that Matthew and Luke must have been using a common source. All right, so notice in Matthew's gospel, you've got an evil and adulterous generation seeks a sign. All right. In Luke's gospel, however, you've just got this generation is an evil generation. It seeks a sign, but no sign shall be given but the sign of Jonah. Okay, lots of agreement there. But this is kind of repetitive and it doesn't show up in Matthew. And also in Matthew's gospel, he adds the word and adulterous. And we know from other places in Matthew's gospel that he likes to add this word adulterous to kind of pump up the rhetoric, as it were. And so Q scholars tend to attribute this extra phrase here to Matthean redaction. Okay, so in other words, this was not original to the Q saying as it appeared in its original source. Okay, and then we also have the addition of this phrase here, the prophet Jonah, whereas Luke just says Jonah. And so this may have been an addition here by Matthew. And then we have this little extra thing here about how just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. That is very different in Luke's gospel. Luke doesn't have anything about Jesus or the Son of Man being 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth, or as Jonah was in the whale. He just says, for as Jonah became a sign to the men of Nineveh, so the Son of Man will be a sign to this generation. Now, what Q scholars will often say is that this is most likely the original version, right? And now it becomes a matter of interpretation, because what did Jesus mean here when he said, just as Jonah became a sign to the men of Nineveh? Well, the saying that is usually thought to occur just after this, you can see it here in Luke's gospel. Now, Q scholars usually think that this saying here came after this one in Q. So if we go from this, for as Jonah became a sign to the men of Nineveh, so the Son of Man will be to this generation. And then we go here, the men of Nineveh will arise in judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And behold, something greater than Jonah is here. So when verse 29 is read in connection with verse 32, well, it could be argued that the sign of Jonah is not this moment when the prophet is spewed out by the fish onto the dry land. That's not the sign. The sign instead is simply the preaching of Jonah. I think that really misconstrues what's going on here, because remember, these are originally most likely independent sayings. So if these two sayings were brought together at some point, it doesn't necessarily, this saying here about Jonah and this saying here about Jonah, if these were originally independent sayings, then we can't infer from this what this saying is talking about, okay? And I think it makes a lot more sense to understand the sign of Jonah to refer not to his preaching. That's not a sign, that's just an activity. The sign, the big sign in the life of Jonah was when he was eaten by the fish and then spewed out onto land afterwards. So I think Matthew is really getting it right when he says here that just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights. He's not talking about the sign of Jonah being a preacher. He's talking about the sign of Jonah being swallowed and vomited up by the whale, or whale is probably the wrong interpretation here. The Greek and the Hebrew really just means fish. So it might have been the case that Jonah was actually eaten by, let's say, a shark or something and died, and then God sort of resurrected his body or something. We don't know. But in any case, my point is that whether this here was original with Q or whether it was sort of Matthew's elaboration on this, the meaning is basically the same. In Luke's version, the saying is a bit more cryptic because it's worded so tersely. But the meaning in Luke's version is almost certainly the same as what we have in Matthew's version, namely that Jesus would become a sign to this generation whenever he rose from the dead, just as Jonah became a sign to the men of Nineveh whenever he emerged alive after being 3 days in the belly of the sea creature. Okay, so anyway, the hypothetical Q text here would be something like this. This generation seeks a sign, but no sign shall be given it except the sign of Jonah. For as Jonah became a sign to the men of Nineveh, so the Son of Man will be to this generation. Okay, so I realize that's all very complicated, and hopefully you were able to follow a good bit of what I was talking about. The long and short of it is that we have this supposed source that we try to reconstruct, and if it were possible to do that, then it would be very interesting because we'd effectively have another early source at our disposal that we could look at to try to understand or explore what the early followers of Jesus believed, or perhaps we could get some more additional historical information about Jesus, and so things of that nature. And so it's a very interesting, and you can understand why it would be also a very debated topic. So here are some of the most debated issues with regard to Q. Well, obviously, much of this reconstruction that we've looked at, and we could go through lots of other passages as well and show you that there's a lot that is very ambiguous and scholars will debate about. And it's because so much of our judgments have to rely on speculation and very subjective reasonings. Scholars therefore continue to debate what exactly this hypothetical document originally said. The value of Q for study of the historical Jesus and the origins of Christianity are also debated. Some think that Q is extremely valuable, and others think it's less so. For example, some scholars think that Q was a largely random collection of sayings without any real organizing themes. If that's true, it may be misguided to think that Q represents the distinctive views of some very early Christian community, or that it tells us something important about the development of early Christianity. Others, however, think that Q was highly organized, that it contained the core beliefs of an early community of Jesus followers. Its distinctive views are therefore highlighted in order to bring out how Jesus' followers were much more diverse and even unorthodox than we may have imagined. Well, this is all very highly debated among scholars, and much of the debate turns on how to classify Q in terms of its genre. If Q was mostly a collection of sayings and not a full-fledged narrative like what we have in the Gospels, what does this suggest about its purpose? Was it used perhaps for catechetical instruction? In other words, to help communicate some of Jesus' teachings to new disciples? Or was it maybe used as a missionary document? Perhaps it was a kind of biography, like how I was characterizing the canonical Gospels earlier. Here, we would of course have to bear in mind that ancient biographies were very different from modern ones in that they tried to capture a person's essence, not so much to draw up a chronological outline of a person's life. Jesus' early followers might have thought that they could capture Jesus' essence by recalling his teachings and other short anecdotes about his life, as for example about his baptism and temptation in the wilderness, his healing of the centurion's servant, and his interactions with the disciples of John and his denunciations of the scribes and Pharisees. Anyway, there's clearly a lot that we don't know about this supposed source. We don't know its purpose, its unity, its authorship. We don't know its date. I mean, if Mark used it, then it would have needed to exist before he wrote his gospel, but many scholars doubt whether Mark used it. I personally think that he did use it, but even if that's true, there's a further question about whether it was subsequently redacted, so that new material was added, perhaps even after Mark wrote his gospel. We also don't know the extent of Q. In other words, how much material was actually contained in this source. Usually Q is discussed by scholars in terms of its minimal content. Scholars look at the places where Matthew and Luke agree with one another over against Mark, and they say, okay, that's the extent of Q. But that's not the extent of Q necessarily. That's just the minimal content. That's the content that we can all agree was contained in Q. But if Matthew and Luke were both using Q, it seems prima facie likely that they would have chosen to exclude at least some of Q's material and not to include all of it when they wrote their Gospels. After all, they sometimes exclude sayings and stories from Mark's Gospel. So if we find a saying or a short anecdote in Matthew's Gospel that has nothing corresponding to it either in Mark's or Luke's Gospel, this may be because Matthew was drawing from Q, not simply inventing material or drawings from some other source besides Q, like M or whatever. Same thing for Luke. If we find a saying or a short anecdote in Luke that only occurs in Luke, but not in Matthew or Mark, it may be because Luke was drawing here on Q. But we can't say that for sure, of course, because the saying or anecdote is only found in Luke. Scholars tend to classify uniquely Lucan material as L rather than Q, but this doesn't really get around the problem. Then we have the so-called Markan overlap material. This is when we find material in Mark's Gospel which agrees somewhat with what we find in Matthew's and Luke's Gospels, except that here the agreement is much closer between Matthew and Luke than it is with Mark. How do we deal with this material? Was this also taken from Q? Was Mark perhaps using Q, but modifying it quite a bit, while Matthew and Luke were using Q, but only modifying it slightly? You can maybe start to appreciate why it's so difficult to define the extent of Q's content. And then, of course, we have an even bigger problem to deal with, because some scholars argue that Q didn't even exist, but is just like a modern scholarly construct. Well, I can't deal with that issue here. Suffice it to say that I do think that some kind of early common source was used by Matthew and Luke whenever they weren't using Mark. I suspect that they used multiple sources, actually. But let's try to keep things simple here. If we only take into consideration what we can characterize as minimal Q, that is, the material that is not found in Mark's Gospel, but which Matthew and Luke have in common, what can we say about the content of this hypothetical document? With regard to Jesus' life and teachings, for example, what can we learn from Q? Well, we learn that Jesus was preceded in his ministry by John the Baptist, and probably also that he was baptized by John, although this might not qualify as minimal Q since it's found also in Mark's Gospel. We also learn that Jesus was one of John's associates or friends, that he was tempted in the wilderness by the devil, that his ministry centered on towns and cities in Galilee. He worked miracles of healing and cast out demons. He was not on good terms with the religious leaders of his day. He taught using parables. He taught about the importance of faith. He taught about prayer. He taught about loving or forgiving one's enemies and not retaliating. Okay, those are all pretty non-controversial. Most Q scholars will agree with those points. But now there are some more controverted points about Q that I should mention here. For example, Jesus' death. Well, Jesus' death is not explicitly narrated as it is in Mark's gospel, although there's some dispute about whether Q may have had a passion narrative. I won't go into that, but that's at least something that we need to bear in mind as we go further with this. So let's suppose that there was no passion narrative within Q. What does that say about Jesus' death? Did the author of Q not believe that Jesus died? Well, clearly he did believe that Jesus died because we have that being implied in these texts here. Jesus, for example, says, "Whoever will follow me, let him take up his cross." It's kind of implicit that Jesus is going to be crucified. But then the significance of Jesus' death as an atoning sacrifice is apparently not explored in Q. So what does that mean? Well, it could mean that the author of Q, or the early Christian community that Q represents, didn't view Jesus' death as an atoning sacrifice. And there are some scholars who have tried to make that argument. But it could also just be that Jesus' atoning death was not something that the author of Q felt needed to be discussed. Perhaps in the type of document that he was trying to produce, there was no perceived reason to discuss Jesus' sacrificial atoning death. Or perhaps Q did have something to say about this topic, but neither Matthew nor Luke chose to include that material in their Gospels because they were already using Mark's passion narrative. And that narrative already makes the point about Jesus' death being an atoning sacrifice. There are any number of explanations that could be proposed here, so I think it's a bit too speculative to infer anything significant about Q's apparent neglect of Jesus' atoning death. Okay, but then another issue is whether Q presents Jesus as having been resurrected. Well, his resurrection does seem to be implied in these sayings here, but some scholars dispute this, interpreting, for example, the sign of Jonah either as a reference only to Jesus' preaching or to his second coming. Also, some dispute whether 13:31 through 33 is from Q. They might say, well, it may have just been Luke that wrote that. I've already explained a little bit about why I think the sign of Jonah is referring to his death and resurrection and not simply his preaching. But anyway, moving on. So Jesus' second coming, what about that? Is that mentioned in Q? Well, Jesus often refers to the Son of Man coming in judgment. And traditionally, the Son of Man has always been understood to be Jesus. But some have suggested that he's talking about someone other than himself, that the Son of Man is like some other figure that Jesus was anticipating. I think that interpretation has fallen out of fashion. Rudolf Bultmann was someone who espoused that idea. But yeah, it hasn't really gained much traction among commentators and scholars. So anyway, moving on now to M. So we've talked about Q, now we need to talk about M. Matthew's Gospel often contains material that is not found in Mark and does not overlap with any material in Luke's Gospel either. It's possible that this uniquely methane material may in fact derive from Q, or from some other source, or from Matthew himself. Maybe Matthew just wrote this stuff. That seems kind of unlikely. But anyway, source critics classify this material as M. And there are other parts of Matthew's Gospel that may have also been included here, such as his genealogy and the stories relating to Jesus' nativity, the miraculous events surrounding Jesus' death, the guard at the tomb and his report, and Jesus' post-resurrection appearance in Galilee. But here are the main things that when people talk about M, they are usually willing to say that these were drawn from some source that Matthew had at his disposal. So you have the parable of the wheat and the tares. Notice also that they're kind of lumped together into like just a few sections of Matthew's Gospel. So a lot of them are in chapter 13, and then a lot of them are here in chapter 20 and 21. So perhaps Matthew, when he was composing his Gospel, he just he had like a couple of written sources at his desk, and he said, I'm going to use this one now and bring in some information from this. And so that kind of makes sense with the way everything is grouped. But anyway, it's interesting to look at the parables here, maybe read them and think about whether these were drawn from Q, perhaps, or whether they were drawn from some other unique source that only Matthew had at his disposal. Okay, and then we have L. L is a putative source that was used, this just means like hypothetical, a hypothetical source that was used in the composition of Luke's gospel. It contained things like the parables of the prodigal son, the Good Samaritan, and the rich man in Hades. So again, some very well-known parables, but just as these here were unique to Matthew's gospel, these are unique to Luke's gospel. That's why it's called L. So L may have also contained Luke's genealogy, because that's something else that we only find in Luke's gospel. Obviously, Matthew has his own unique genealogy as well, which differs in lots of ways from Luke's. You know what a genealogy is, I trust, but if you don't, it's, so-and-so begot so-and-so, so-and-so begot so-and-so, so-and-so begot so-and-so, and on until you get to Jesus. So Luke traces his genealogy all the way back to Adam and then ultimately to God, whereas Matthew only traces it back to Abraham. So obviously they differ in that regard, but then also when you look at the father and the mother of Jesus, well, obviously they both agree that Luke is Jesus' mother, but the father in Matthew's gospel, if you look at the genealogy of, what is this? That's Matthew, that's Luke on the left. You see that the father of Jesus is Joseph, but then the genealogy seems to differ as you look in Matthew and Luke here. Some people think that that's because Luke is giving us a maternal genealogy, whereas Matthew is giving us a paternal genealogy. So there's that, and so they seem to have been drawing from different sources, right? Anyway, there's all of that too, as well as some of the early stories relating to Jesus' nativity, his passion narrative, and his record of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances here in these verses. Okay, we also don't know much about the date, the authorship, the unity, and the provenance of L. Just as the same thing could be said of Q and M. Okay, provenance is just where did this come from? What part of the world? Is it from Judea, from Galilee, from Egypt, from Rome, from Syria, whatever? There's all sorts of guesses as to where these things came from. So much of that, you might say, is quite speculative and uncertain. But it seems pretty undeniable that the gospel writers were drawing on earlier sources. And in fact, Luke explicitly tells us that that's what he's doing. He says in his prologue, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us." So he's aware of the fact that there were other accounts that existed in his day, just as they were handed down to us by those who, from the first, were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account to you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. Okay, so Luke here, he mentions something about eyewitnesses as one of his sources, or being one of the sources that was accessible to the people who were writing these early accounts of Jesus' life. And so no doubt Luke, if he was aware of those sources, or even those living eyewitnesses, he would have tried to draw on those as much as he could. Okay, and some of this here just repeats what I've already said, but I'll go ahead and read it anyway. Note that Luke speaks of many accounts of the Christian faith which had already been written prior to his gospel. Among these accounts, we should probably exclude Matthew's gospel, since Luke doesn't appear to have known it. On the other hand, we should include Mark, Q, and perhaps L, among others. Note also that Luke speaks of these accounts as having derived from eyewitnesses. These were perhaps Jesus' first disciples or earliest followers. All right, so that concludes my lecture on source and redaction criticism. In the next one, we'll talk about questions of gospel authorship.